You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Whether you're a chef or just love going to restaurants, you know the best ingredients are everything, especially when it comes to beef. In Northern Australia, there's a different approach to raising high-quality beef. Westholme, based in Queensland and Northern Territory, is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme stewards 16 million acres of rangeland guided by their natural ecosystem. They're led by a belief that if they balance the needs of their cattle with the needs of the environment, both can thrive. Westholme's team of rangeland experts and nature managers use a variety of tools to monitor and respond to the welfare of the environment, like satellites that assess grass health and on-the-ground research. Cattle are happier when they have the freedom to forage and explore, so Westholme ensures that they can roam wild, foraging at will for the first 2 to 3 years of their lives. Their cows graze on native grasses like Mitchell grass, which is only found in Australia, along with dozens of other plants, herbs, and seasonal legumes. The result is a high-quality Wagyu beef that reflects the terroir of Northern Australia and a flavor suited to complement any cuisine. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
Hello, welcome to Japan Eats. I'm your host Aki Katayama, food writer and a director of the New York Japanese Culinary Academy, which promotes deeper understanding of Japanese cuisine in America. We are broadcasting live from Brooklyn, New York. This show is all about Japanese food and food culture. We see sushi at every day in the supermarket, but what is beyond sushi? We hear dashi ramen izakaya, but what exactly are they? Japanese food is still a mystery for many people, and I try to demystify it in this program from my crew guests. My guest today is John Gontner, who is one of the world's leading sake experts and educators. He has been writing and lecturing about sake since 1994 in various newspapers and magazines in Japan and overseas. He has published multiple books on sake across 2 languages and hundreds of articles on the topic. Several times each year, he runs Sake Professional Course, a week-long intensive sake study course held both in and outside of Japan, as well as advanced level of the course. John joined us in episode 25 in December 2015 and discussed his intriguing path to becoming a sake expert, why sake was gaining popularity in the world, how to get to know more about sake, and many other topics. The sake has become popular globally over the last decades, but we tend to think that sake is something to drink only at Japanese restaurants. However, more non-Japanese restaurants are serving sake, including Michelin-starred restaurants like Per Se, Blue Hill at Tom Barnes, and 11 Madison Park in New York. So today we'll discuss food pairings, in particular sake and non-Japanese food. But before you start, Japan Eats is available on the Heritage Radio Network website, as well as on the iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify as a podcast. So please go to iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, whichever you listen to, and subscribe to Japan Eats. And please write a review. We truly appreciate your feedback. Now, let's start a conversation with John Gontner. Hello, John. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Akiko. I can't believe it's been 9 years since the last time I was on this show.
Right.
Time flies.
Right. And then a lot of things happen in the world of sake. So for listeners who have not listened to episode 25, tell us about your background and where you're from. How did you get into sake and become an authority in sake?
Okay, I can do that. I'll try and keep it as concise as possible. So I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, or the state of Ohio. I've lived in various places in Ohio. And in 1988, I went to Japan on something called the JET program, which is run by the Ministry of Education in Japan. And it's an English teaching program. Actually, they have other languages as well. But in any event, I signed up for JET, or I was accepted to JET. And while doing that, I didn't have any particular interest in sake, but some coworkers, in particular one gentleman who was a few years older than me, introduced me to some very good sake. And it was something that just kind of blew me away from the beginning. I really wasn't looking to get into it, but all of a sudden it was the most fascinating thing I ever tasted. And the more I got into it, the more I enjoyed it, the more I realized how deep a world it was. But even though I was very interested in sake, I really had no ambition of making it my work or anything like that. But over the years, very naturally, I got more exposed to it, and I got more interested in it and more interested in it, and started getting involved in the industry. And my work, I only did JET for 2 years, and then I moved on to my original discipline, which is electrical engineering. And while doing that, again, I just got more and more into sake and involved with the industry and tastings. And slowly, organically, one thing led to another. I started writing for the newspaper, then I started writing books, then I started doing seminars. Eventually, I got involved in export. And once I started working through export, I realized that if you don't educate the trade overseas, people aren't going to understand it and not be willing to sell it. And so I started getting involved in education as well. I further branched into, I've always been writing across all of this, newsletters, this and that, but I got involved in some publishing. I'm involved in publishing a magazine called Sake Today. And then because I'm firmly rooted in the industry, I got involved in publishing a industry-focused newsletter called Sake Industry News. And again, I continue with seminars and everything else I ever started with. So as time passes, I get increasingly busy, all with sake.
Well, it sounds like not you found sake, but sake found you. So you are drawn
Yeah,
into
it is
the
like
world of
that.
sake.
I didn't really choose this path. It chose me.
Right. And so before we get into today's topic, sake and food pairings, could you tell us how the sake industry is doing lately? And in our last conversation 9 years ago, you said the sake industry has been shrinking domestically but growing in export markets. So any changes since then?
Well, lots of changes, but those 2 points are the same. It continues to contract domestically, but it's not contrasting super fast. If you look at all sake produced, and if you were to very roughly break it up into what you might call premium and what you might call less than fully premium, the regular stuff is contracting. But the premium stuff is pretty much holding its ground. It's not really growing hugely. In fact, the numbers up and down are pretty much statistically insignificant. But it's pretty much holding its own. So in terms of that, it does continue to be contracting in Japan, except for premium sake. Now, export does continue to grow, but remember, all export is less than 7% of all sake produced. If you look at French wine or Italian wine, they're between 25 and 35% of domestic production is exported. Sake is nowhere near that, but it is growing every year. But really, 10% of 7% isn't a whole lot, but still, we'll take what we can get. So in that sense, pretty much the industry numbers are pretty much the same as they were, but moving in a somewhat positive direction. I've also heard, though, that profitability for a lot of brewers is up, which is a good thing. My own observations are that some brewers are doing really well and others less so. But that doesn't really show up in statistics, does it? How some brewers are doing really, really well and growing and becoming very popular and well-known, and the brewers behind them are very proactive in marketing, whereas others are not. You don't really see that in statistics. So I guess one big word to describe what's going on in the industry is change. Lots of change, stuff never before seen in the industry. Of course, COVID shook everything up for a couple of years, and I don't think it's really settled down from that yet. So it's kind of hard to see where it's all going. It might all end up being very positive, and certainly the industry's been through a lot worse.
Right, and I really want to stress that the reason domestically sake's consumption is reduced or the production is not as stunning as like 50, 70 years ago is that the labor force is shrinking and aging, and the image of sake drinker used to be older man. And when I was little, my dad was drinking sake, and I was like, I have no interest to start drinking sometime in the near future. But now I think the sake image of sake has kind of had a rebirth, and it's more fancier, delicate, and kind of fine dining associated drinks sometimes. So I think it's a good thing. And domestically, I met a couple of younger sake brewers who decided to pursue that traditional business. I think they're really inspired by foreign successful wineries, all those tradition being revived, and I think I feel good energy from sake industry now compared to 10 years ago.
I would agree with that. There's a lot of really vibrant energy. As you pointed out, a lot of younger brewers are embracing tradition, but at the same time, pushing the envelope and making sake that really hasn't been made before. So it's a positive thing. We just need to continue to support them by drinking sake as regularly as we can so that they are motivated more, so that they're able to financially continue and they can see the fruits of their labor too.
Right. So now let's talk about today's topic, sake and food pairings, in particular with non-Japanese food and sake. So, and sake has been, like you said, becoming popular globally, and the U.S. has been the world's biggest importer of Japanese sake for the last 20 years, and the quantity more than doubled between 2012 and 2022, which is amazing. But many of us drink sake only with Japanese food, and a Japanese restaurant is a place to drink sake, despite the fact that non-Japanese restaurants now have sake on the menus, like Michelin-starred Per Se, Blue Hill at Weston Barnes, 11 Barnstable Park in New York. People would never imagine that sake is going to be served at these fancy new American restaurants. So first of all, have you tried many Japanese sake and non-Japanese food pairings? And what was your favorite pairing?
Yeah, I drink sake with Western food all the time. I mean, it's pretty much on the table almost all the time. Not always. I do drink some other things once in a while, but it's almost always on the table. And so I do pair with Western food quite a bit. I will admit that a lot of times I don't want to work so hard, but it's always in the back of my mind. And I think that I naturally avoid any things that I think might be less than a good match. So I'm kind of in the background always thinking about it. And I do it quite a bit. However, I also don't bend over backwards or go out of my way for the absolute best pairing every time I sit down at the table with sake and food. In terms of one example of something I really, really like, before I talk about the pairing, I have to talk about a type of sake called kimoto. And kimoto is a way of preparing the yeast that makes the sake somewhat gamey. And to me, it gives it a real fine-grained, almost spicy flavor. Acidity is a bit higher. Umami is a bit higher. And there's a couple of styles that do that, but one is called kimoto. And to me, grilled lamb with a nice kimoto is just an outstanding pairing. I can't imagine anything better than that. Another simpler one is if you take a junmaishu, and we could talk about the grades later, but a fairly stable, sturdy, rich sake. And a lot of junmaishu have a good bolstering acidity. So if you take one with a decent acidity and a cream-based pasta dish, that's another pairing that's just outstanding. With some crushed pepper on the pasta, really, really, really good. So those are two off the top of my head that I'm really, 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 really easy to prepare, familiar to everybody, and just pairings that will just be outstanding every time.
Right. So, what is the difference between Japanese sake and for something like wine in terms of flavor components?
Well, I think that first of all, I mean, a lot of the components in sake are also in wine, and a lot of the components of wine are also in sake. So there's a lot there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of what they share together. However, if you look at sake, first of all, the acidity of sake is actually much lower than wine. And again, it depends on the wine, it depends on the sake, but on the average, I think the acidity measured by titration, the same way they measured it in wine, is about somewhere between 1/10 and 1/5 the acidity of wine. Having said that, sake also has a fairly light profile, a fairly small footprint. It's just not as big. It doesn't have as big a presence. So that even though it's got less acidity, the acidity can be quite prominent in sake. It can stand out quite a bit, and it can be really leveraged when trying to make a pairing with it because the overall package is smaller. The acidity, even if it's lower, can stand out quite a bit. That's one big difference. I think that also sake doesn't have any tannins. Now, not all wine has it, but when it does, it's a very, you have to be careful with it, but you can use that or avoid that when making a pairing with wine, whereas with sake, it's basically not even a consideration. Also, I think that the alcohol is a little bit lower. I wouldn't say that. I think most wine has a slightly lower alcohol content. I mean, we're talking 13, 14 versus typically 16 or so in your average sake. Again, sake can be higher or lower than that. And that's another factor too. I also think that the aromas in sake aren't usually as prominent and as expressive as they are in most wine. Again, it depends on the wine, and it, of course, depends on the sake. So all those factors combine to make pairing a little bit different. Not hugely different, but a little bit different.
Right. And also, I think we're going to discuss a little bit more about umami later, but I think wine doesn't have umami like sake, right? So I think it's a very important element that I look for sake because I want that umami in my beverage.
Yeah, again, you're absolutely correct. I would say a lot of wine does have umami, but again, with sake, because it's such a smaller package, And because there's so much conscious awareness about umami in Japanese food and in Japanese sake, very often it's much more of a prominent factor when looking to pair sake and food. 100% correct.
Right. Okay, so we'll take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about unique elements of sake that make food pairing much easier than wine. So please stay with us.
Today's program is brought to you by Korin, a supplier of Japanese chef knives and restaurant supplies. Korin is proud of their Japanese culture and traditions, but they want you to know that their products are not just for Japanese restaurants. Their knives and tableware bring out the best qualities of food from every culture and fit into every restaurant from French to Pan-Asian to American. And that is why they're located in New York City, where people from every country in the world come to eat. Korin's Tribeca showroom is home to the most extensive collection of Japanese chef knives in the world, including Japan. Stop by to view their exquisitely designed tableware and the rarest natural sharpening stones. They have a whole range of knife services from repair and rust removal to reshaping and realigning. Korin is dedicated to this ideal, bringing the highest quality Japanese design to your table so you can experience the unparalleled quality of Japanese craftsmanship in your home or restaurant. For more information, visit korin.com.
Welcome back. You're listening to Japan Eats, broadcasting live from Brooklyn, New York. And I'm your host, Akikatema. My guest today is John Gontner, who is one of the world's leading non-Japanese sake experts and educators. I would say was leading non-Japanese or non-Japanese sake experts and educators, because all those experts in the sake world are mostly taught by you. And I've never seen any English-speaking sake educator who's not taught by you. So you are
They're out there, trust me. There's plenty of them.
Okay, I have to find them. So we talked about difference between sake and wine, and there are some scales that indicate the taste of Japanese sake, which I think we, in America and in the outside of Japan, it's better to see numbers. So one easy number, the scale, is Nihon Shuro. So first of all, what is Nihon Shuro?
Well, let me preface this response by letting you know, Akiko, you may be disappointed in my response this time. But I'll be happy to answer your question and we'll go from there. So the Nihon Shudo is a measurement that is taken on sake. And what it is the specific gravity of the sake. What the specific gravity is, it's the density of the sake compared to the density of pure distilled water. Now, every alcoholic beverage uses a measurement of specific gravity. Wine uses it, although I might call it different terms. Beer uses it. Because what you do when you look at the specific gravity, you look at how thick or heavy the liquid is. And sugar will make it thicker and heavy. So will other things, of course. But then what you can look at is how much that sugar drops during fermentation. And that tells you how much of the sugar is being converted from sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide. And by doing this, you can see how your fermentation is proceeding. So the specific gravity, and therefore the Nihon Shudo in sake, is something that's used every day by brewers. And in the end, if you look at wine, very often they have a residual sugar and things like that. In sake, the Nihon Shudo that we see on the label was the final Nihon Shudo. It was the Nihon Shudo level when they completed brewing. And so what that tells you is basically how much sugar is left in the liquid. It's actually not quite that simple. So what the Nihon Shudo will basically tell you is sweetness or dryness. Now, the way the scale works, there is a mathematical correlation to specific gravity. There's an equation for it. But the Nihon Shudo meter actually it's open-ended, but usually you see about, -5 or 6 to +10 or 12 for most sake in the market. A Nihon Shudo of 0 would mean exactly the same density as pure water. So the way this scale works is very simply, the higher the number, the drier the sake. Higher is drier. The lower the number, the sweeter the sake is going to be. Is it really that simple? No, but that's the overall general way of looking at things. Furthermore, 0 is not neutral, sweet or dry, not by any stretch of the imagination. That's a matter of perception. So in my mind, I would say these days, +3 or +4 is probably neutral in terms of sweetness and dryness in the perception of most people. But that's not an absolute, that's just perception.
Right.
Another thing, and this is important, is that you really can't trust the Nihon Shudo except in its extreme manifestations. For example, no one's going to be able to tell the difference between a +4 or a +5. or a -1 and a 0. It's just not going to happen. And to say what's sweet or dry is going to vary from person to person. But if you look at the extreme manifestations, for example, +9, +10, that's going to be dry by anybody's assessment. Or -2 or -3 is going to be sweet by anybody's assessment. So the Nihonshu was originally meant for brewers, and somehow it got out of the breweries and into the hands of the consuming public. And it's cool and it's interesting, but I would never completely trust it except in its extreme manifestations. One reason for that is because let's say you have two sake and they both have, just an example, a +4 Nihonshu. That's what was measured by the hydrometer when the sake was finished. Well, if one has a higher acidity than the other, they're not going to taste the same sweetness or dryness. The one with the higher acidity will taste drier. If one is unpasteurized, usually that tastes sweeter to most people. If one is served at really cold temperatures and the other room temperature, again, the one at room temperature will taste a bit sweeter. They're the same sake, right? Or the same Nihonshu anyway. And then if you warm it up again, after a certain point, you lose sense of all sweetness and dryness, and they kind of taste the same. So the temperature at which you serve it is another thing that's going to confuse the Nihonshu. That's why you can't look at that alone. Another would be ginjo aromatics. If your sake smells really fruity, a lot of people think that it's unpasteurized. I'm sorry, that it's sweeter, even if it isn't. So a lot of things affect sweetness or dryness, which is why you can't always trust the Nihonshu just by itself, except in its extreme manifestations.
Interesting. One time I had I think +19 Nihonshudo, and it was supposed to be very, very dry, but it was like, okay, but it's not as extremely higher than I would say +8 or 7 I had in the same tasting. So like you
Is that
said,
right?
yeah, it was I think, and the sando, right? That's acidity is sando, which usually is not on the label, but it's the lactic acid or other types of acidity in fermentation, right? Is that how you determine um, the
Yes, it's a
level of acidity?
titration. It's a
Right.
titration, just like they do it in wine. However, uh, when they measure the acidity in sake and put that number on the label, not all of the acids are measured. Not all of them are measured. So it wouldn't be the pH of the sake. Some just don't get measured through the method they do it. It's just not important to the brewers to know some of these acidities that are out there. But basically, the higher the acidity, the drier the sake is going to taste. Uh, and you're right, it's not always on a label. There's no obligation for a brewer to put either the Nihonshu or the acidity on the label. Some do, some don't. I don't think anybody hides it. I think some brewers just think that it's not going to be so useful to consumers, and they'd rather put something else on the label. But sometimes it's not on there, as you pointed out.
Right. It could be misleading because of the reasons we are talking about. There's an interaction of each element. So you have to taste it to get to know. But you had a general sense, if it's negative numbers in Nihonshido, you just assume it tend to be sweeter. But you have to
Yeah,
imagine that there's a range of it. And that's how Toji, the sake brewer, really shows their skills and talent and how you can diversify the flavor out of
right.
the same ingredients, right?
Yeah, I mean, talking about this just a little bit more, whether it be acidity or Nihonshido or the combination of them together. I mean, when the Toji and the brewers measure it in the brewery, it's done using in a laboratory, using laboratory equipment. But when you get out in the street or in restaurants or at home or things like that, if you're having a really salty dish, your sake is going to taste sweet by comparison, right? If you're drinking a bunch of really sweet sake, and you have one that's neutral, it's going to taste dry by comparison. So there's all these factors in the real world that kind of lessen the importance of just the number of Nihonshu and acidity, which are actually measured in a laboratory in the brewery. So there's that too.
Right. Interesting. So, well, I think for now, I really have to assume there are some elements, but at the end of the day, you really have to consider even, the minerality in the water to anything, the mold in a brewery or the region, or just like so many different, of course, the types of rice, and there's so many elements to affect the sake. But I think that's the beauty of it. So,
Yeah,
but
that is. I agree.
right. And then also, we mentioned umami earlier. What determines the level of umami in sake?
not surprisingly, a lot of things do. But most significantly is amino acid content. Amino acid content is tied directly to umami. Certainly, regular acidity, for example, the hardness or softness of the water, other things like that will also contribute to an overall sense of umami in sake. But probably most commonly connected or associated with umami is amino acids. Now, by enzymes that comes from the moldy rice called koji, proteins are broken down into amino acids. So depending on the way they make the koji, depending on the enzymes created during the brewing process, depending on the temperature that the fermentation carries on under, all of those things will affect just how much proteins are broken down into amino acids. And there's other sources of amino acids too, but those are the main ones. And that will affect your perception of umami in sake.
Right. So like you mentioned earlier, the Kimoto method of making is kind of maximize that umami because of the slow process of fermentation. There's more aeration and natural absorption of what's in the air, like natural traditional way. So it's interesting that umami is everywhere in food, from cheese to tomato to steak to anything, right? So sounds like I think umami is also key element in food pairings. So so
Yeah,
before
actually, umami is a major, major element. I mean, there's many times when I just use umami alone, and that's enough. That's enough to get a good pairing going. That's
right.
enough for a basic, functional pairing between sake and food. If you're not really familiar with umami, you might have trouble assessing it just by looking at a dish or making it yourself even. But once you get used to that, it's pretty much a great, great way to base your pairings.
Right. So we're going to talk about actual dishes, non-Japanese dishes in a moment, but there's some major types of sake, like ginjo, daginjo, junmai, yamahai, and like kimoto, you said. So could you give us a quick one-on of these sake types and typical flavor
Yeah,
characteristics?
sure. It's going to be tough because there's a lot of types, and just talking about them without seeing a diagram or things like that might be hard for listeners to visualize and to understand at one grasp. But let's very briefly, if we talk about it. So all sake on the market is made using rice, water, and koji, which is steamed rice inoculated with a mold, which is called koji kin or koji mold in Japanese, Aspergillus oryzae in the scientific world. And it's usually about 20 to 25% of all the rice going into one batch is inoculated with the koji. So uses koji, in other words, rice inoculated with that koji mold. And so we've got all sake is made using rice, water, koji, and a lot of sake has some distilled alcohol added to it. Now, in about 60% of the market, that's just regular sake, futsushu in Japanese, just regular sake. And they make that using rice, water, and koji, and then they add a good amount of distilled alcohol for economic reasons. It's easier to make the product you can really extend your yields by doing that. And while that might not sound like a great thing to everybody, a lot of futsushu is really, really, really tasty. So you really shouldn't diss that without trying it. Again, some are cheap and some taste cheap, but a lot of them are just really enjoyable products and so wonderfully priced. Once you get above futsushu, most people refer to this as premium sake, and that's got its drawbacks in pigeonholing sake into that term, but at the same time, it makes it easier to understand. So once you look at the top grades of sake, in other words, everything except futsushu, and again, to reiterate this, futsushu is about 60% of the market. So the top 40% of the market or so, once you get into that, the more you mill the rice, the higher the grade is going to be. So there's 6 grades above that, There's basically 6 grades above regular sake. And they will vary on basically on how much you've milled the rice. Why is that important? Because in sake rice, you've got starch in the center and you've got fat and protein around the outside. Oversimplifying grossly, you don't want the fat and protein. So the more you mill the rice, the more you take away the fat and protein. And while that takes away some character, that gives you a lighter, more delicate flavor profile, and it tends to let aromas come out a bit more. So something called junmaishu is a grade of sake that's probably about 10 to 15% of the market right now. And what junmaishu is, it's made with rice, water, and koji only, no distilled alcohol. It tends to be rich. It tends to have a lot of umami. It tends to have a lot of viscosity, a lot of weight, and often a higher acidity. If you take that Junmaishu stuff, and if you add a little bit of alcohol, just a little bit, then you've got something called honjozo. And honjozo has a rice milling requirement of at least 60%. In other words, you have to mill away at least the outer 40%, leaving no more than the inner 60% behind. And once fermentation is complete, you can add a little bit of alcohol. What that does is it lightens the product and it pulls out a lot more aromas and flavors. So above those two classifications, we've got 4. And those 4 are collectively known as ginjo, ginjoshu. And ginjo refers to super premium sake. And within the realm of ginjo, there's actually 4 subclasses. The 4 subclasses are something called regular ginjo. So yes, ginjo is a subclass of ginjo. And for that, you must mill the rice so that no more than 60% of the original size remains. And then you've got something called junmai ginjo, which is ginjo to which you have not added the alcohol at all. That tends to be a little bit richer. And then we move into the dai ginjo classification, which is basically ginjo to die for. And if you mill it down to 50% or more, and very often it goes way beyond that, you've got something called dai ginjo, and you're allowed to add a little bit of alcohol to that. And that really brings out flavors and aromas. So dai ginjo is going to be very aromatic and very light. If you don't add the alcohol, you'll get a slightly richer version of that, and that's known as junmai dai ginjo. So those are the classifications. The easiest thing to remember is that the top 4 classifications are known as ginjo. If you're drinking something with the word ginjo somewhere embedded on the label, you're drinking about the top 15% of all sake, and it's going to be aromatic. Now, I want to hasten to add that doesn't mean it's the only thing worth drinking. Every classification, Junmaishu, Honjozo in particular, have some wonderful sake within them. So to always go for the ginjo right away probably isn't your best option. So bear that in mind as we go through these things.
I heard some brewers choose not to call it daiginjo because it sounds too premium, even if the milling rate qualifies daiginjo. So it's like you really have to taste and actually enjoy what your preference is, because you might like the fat and protein rich junmai style without going to ginjo, daiginjo. So it's like just a category. It's not like ranking, right?
That's correct. It's a category. It's not a ranking.
Right.
The ginjo and the dai ginjo tend to be more expensive. That gets everybody's attention, but that's not necessarily the only thing that you want to be drinking. You'd be really depriving yourself of a lot if you focus too much on ginjo and dai ginjo sakes.
Right. And also over the course of your meal, at the beginning, you may want to have something lighter like daiginjo, ginjo, but then towards the end, the heavier meal, you might want to pair with junmai or something like that. So let's talk about actual dishes. So for example, I looked up popular American foods, and there's so many, but for example, what's the best, in your opinion, to pair with cheeseburger?
Well, I was thinking about this, but you have to bear in mind some things. See, there's never a short answer to a sake question. But I mean, you have to bear a lot of things in mind, like condiments, right? So if you have a cheeseburger with a lot of ketchup on it, that's sweet. That's going to completely make you want a different sake than if you had, for example, mustard on it, right? Which can be spicy. Or pickles, which can be somewhat sour. So the cheeseburger itself is fine. But the way people eat it is really going to affect what sake goes well with it. But to me, I think if you didn't put too many condiments on your cheeseburger, nobody eats cheeseburgers that way, but if you didn't, I would lean toward a slightly sweet junmaishu. And I think that the key word for the sake I would pair would be presence, weight, gravitas. In other words, something with a bit of weight, a bit of presence, a bit of viscosity, and a little bit of a sweetness. I think that will pair with the cheeseburger quite well. Sake like that tends to have a moderate amount of umami, which will probably tie in with the cheese. The acidity that it probably has will probably cut through the oil and fat of the meat if it's there, and other aspects. Pickles might pair well with a viscous sake as well. So there's a lot of reasons that kind of sake will go well.
What about steak, beef
And
steak?
again, it depends on many, many things. It's not a simple answer. For example, if you had a very lightly grilled piece of lean meat, that's a steak, that's one thing. But if you have a big, fat, meaty one that's been seared on a grill, that would be completely different. Either way, though, most steaks that you're going to have would have a good amount of fat in them. So I would start with acidity. In other words, I would let acidity drive the main decision of the sake I would go with. An umami-driven flavor would match the gaminess of the meat. Some people might salt it, some others might sauce it. So there's a type of sake called a yamahai. And a yamahai is not a grade. A yamahai sake is when they prepare the yeast in a special way that makes it kind of gamey and wild. And a lot of yamahai junmai will go very well with the steak. The umami will pair, the acidity will cut through the fat, and the presence will not back down to a good meaty steak.
Yeah, I love Yamaha with that gaminess. So
Yeah,
I
it
can
does work
imagine.
well.
Right. And what about the white meat? That's fried chicken, like fried and crispiness, chicken, white meat.
Right. If you're talking about a light, crisp, fried piece of chicken, I would go with a honjozo. In other words, a simple, straightforward, crisp sake more than an umami-driven, sweet or rich sake. I think the crispness would go well with the whiter meat. If you've fried it, you should have some crispness on the outside. And I think the basic nature of a light, simple honjozo would go well with that.
Right. And it's like a regular home cooking, but pasta with tomato sauce, I think that's very popular. What would you suggest?
Yeah, again, I like focusing on umami for this, but typically to me, pasta sauces tend to be a bit more, what's the word, refined or elegant, I think, than a straightforward piece of meat, for example. Much more complex. And so I think we want some umami, but we don't too much. You don't really want a big, powerful yamahai. That would just bludgeon the pasta and tomato sauce out of existence. So you want something that's not too cloying. So a mild umami junmai ginjo. I think Parmesan cheese, too, on top of that pasta would help tie it in to a light umami junmai ginjo. And again, very often I think tomato pasta sauce anyway has some good aromatics to it. And I think the aromatics of a junmai ginjo might tie in well with that, depending on the sake.
Right. And well, just change the direction. What about spicy tacos?
Spicy food is another challenge. And to me, the safest way to enjoy sake with spicy food is to drink nigori. It's chewy. It's got some texture to it. The nigori cloudiness will cool the heat, and it can be really, really enjoyable. Very often, nigori comes off as sweet. That can balance the spiciness too.
So
So I
nigori
think that's a very
basically,
safe pace.
right? So lightly filtered sake, that's nigori, right? So it's kind of a creamy
Yeah,
white tea.
cloudy sake. Cloudy
Right.
sake, right. Again, there's nigori sake or cloudy sake, which is not so thick in the sediment, and there's other stuff that's really, really thick in the sediment. And I would go with something moderate. You certainly don't want too much sediment in there, or it's just going to be hard to pair with anything.
Right. And finally, Thanksgiving turkey, which everybody's gonna have soon, I guess.
Right. Yeah. If you get, and there's a lot of other food on the table, right? Stuffing, potatoes, even bread. And again, I think a simple ginjo, a simple, straightforward ginjoshu, or a junmai ginjoshu, that's not overly aromatic. You don't want all kinds of strawberries and apples competing with your turkey, but a mildly aromatic ginjo, a reasonably priced, mildly aromatic ginjo will pair really well with everything on the Thanksgiving table, in particular, the white meat of the turkey. Probably the dark meat of the turkey too, but even dark meat turkey isn't that heavy. So I think, simple aromatic ginjo, mildly aromatic ginjo would be a great pairing for Thanksgiving.
Right. I'm getting very hungry now. Thanks for your
Right.
recommendations. And then I'm curious though, in Japan, how do people pair Japanese sake with food? Do they tend to drink sake with more non-Japanese food than we would imagine?
That's a good question. The second part of your question is a good question. Will they tend to pair sake with non-Japanese food? A little bit. Probably experimentally, rather than in a structured, well thought out pairing way with Western food. If you look at how they have traditionally, historically done with Japan, to me, it's important to remember that sake developed with washoku. Sake developed with Japanese food. And if you look at washoku, traditional Japanese cuisine, you really don't have any strong bursting out flavors. There's really no, when you make food in Japan, when you make washoku, Japanese food, there's no concocted preparations. In other words, the whole point is to bring out the best nature of the raw materials. If it's fish, you want to bring out the best part of the fish. You don't want to cover that with intense preparations and a lot of heat and things like that. So sake developed in such a way to support and bring out the best aspects of the raw materials that you're using. Be those vegetables with bitterness, be those red meat with umami, be that white meat with very dry, light flavors to it, be it fish, be it baked fish, be it grilled fish, be it raw fish. And so the whole point of sake is that it brings out the nature of the raw materials. And I think that's why a lot of times in Japan, it looks like people might not be paying so much attention to pairings, but in fact, sake developed in such a way that you're almost never going to get a mismatch between any Japanese food on the table and sake. Having said that, you can do very precise pairings. You can look at aromas, you can look at umami, you can look at acidity and fat in the fish. You can do all the things you do with sake in Western food or with wine and food and pair sake very precisely with Japanese food in Japan as well.
Right, interesting. So, I mean, in Japan, of course, you have better access to sake, and more people have sake in the fridge, like regularly. So you don't have to like, oh, I made this one dinner, and then which one shall I pair with? Like this one bottle of sake, you pair with it, and then you might be surprised how perfect it is, regardless of Western style food made in Japan, or I mean, surprisingly. Not many Japanese people eat sushi weekly, and more Western style food is cooked at home as well. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Non-Japanese people outside of Japan start to pair with sake more freely because it's so forgiving. So that's my
Yeah, it is. It is very forgiving.
right.
Good choice of words. I agree 100%. Yeah.
Right. So how do you forecast the way Japanese sake is enjoyed with food in the future?
Well, I think that as more and more people pay attention to the potential for sake for pairing, not only with Japanese, but with Western food, you're just going to get more and more people with a lot more experience focusing on it. And so you're going to get really well thought out, well developed pairings that are well publicized. You'll read about them, people will talk about them, and that will get more and more people interested in it. I think, too, that as time goes on, it will become much more of a natural thing like it is in Japan. People will just trust a sake and maybe just look at a couple of things, right? What they think the aromas might be, what they think the flavors might be, and just kind of roughly pair it with the food on the fly, and that will work out very well. One thing that I think is already happening that's just so great is that wine professionals, sommeliers, are really sometimes, not always, but sometimes they're recommending sake over wine in the places where they work, in the restaurants. And because they do that, customers that have trust in them, that are confident in what the sama is going to choose, are like, wow, man, you're totally right. And all of a sudden we have a new sake fan. Those people will then go out and they'll try and pair sake and food on their own as well. So I do see things progressing in that direction. Maybe not super fast, but definitely at a measured good pace.
Right. And I heard in Paris that activity by French sommeliers are really becoming more increasingly popular. Educating sommelier with sake, and people are very excited about it. And it really makes sense because it's just easy to pair with food in terms of Japanese sake. And sometimes I really carefully choose red wine, and Italians really didn't work with something I prepared. And that's a disappointment. But in terms of Japanese sake, I almost never failed. So,
Yeah, I agree. Almost never is there a train wreck. Almost never is there a complete mismatch with sake. And that's one of the coolest things about sake for sure.
right. Okay. So, well, I think you can never stop working on sake. So, what are your plans and dreams for now?
Well, I mean, my sake work and my involvement with sake, the industry, it's always kind of unfolded naturally for me. And as one thing starts to taper, the next thing becomes clear. So I kind of want to continue in the same capacity, continue doing the same things, but maybe a bit more mellow of a pace. I do enjoy writing and speaking and conveying all the great things about sake. But these days, so many people know so much more about sake. And there's so many people that do a great job teaching about it. But the thing is, sake is so deep and complex that there's always another layer. There's always another level. There's always something else to study. There's always something else to geek out about. And I want to kind of continue to focus on the increasingly geeky stuff, but at the same time, keep it real, keep it practical, keep it usable, and keep it interesting to people. So as everybody gets comfortable with what ginjo is and what Yamaha is and what namazake is, they start to get more interested in little quirky, geeky stuff, and they have the background then to continually find it interesting. And I want to be able to continue to supply people with that kind of information.
Right. I'm always impressed with how you are updated about like, there's an earthquake, which breweries are damaged, or there's always the update of everything happening this moment in sake industry. And also I think it's important, right? Because the new sake flower yeast changing the whole style of sake in one area and getting closer to wine. Meanwhile, people go back to very ancient style of sake making. And it's like you're always up to date and you keep teaching the latest to your students. So I think you're supported by the god of sake and you can never stop.
Yeah, in that sense, I think you're right about that. I'm definitely getting some support from somewhere,
Right.
which I'm grateful for. Very
Right.
appreciative.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, you had that first sake that you found fell in love with. That was the beginning of everything. So,
It was
right.
indeed, yes.
Yeah. So where can we find your updates online and on social media and find out more about your sake courses as well?
Well, I do have a website, www.sake-world.com. There's a hyphen between sake and world. And pretty much everything I do goes through that site. Information about the magazine I'm involved with, Sake Today, information about my newsletter, Sake Industry News. I do have a blog, although I don't update it as often because I'm doing the Sake Industry News newsletter. Other things I put on that site. So the announcements for my website, for my courses as well are there. I am moderately active on the usual suspects of social media. So you can find me as John Gautner on most of those. So poke around and definitely follow me if you're interested in sake. And I'll do what I can to keep everybody supplied with information.
Right, great. So thanks so much for joining us again today, John, and I will look forward to another conversation on the show. And
Same here,
somewhere
Akiko.
else. Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So listeners, if you have any questions or comments about the show or suggestions for show topics or guests, please contact us at japaneats@heritageradionetwork.org or kikotema.com. Japan Needs is a weekly program and it's always available at heritageradionetwork.org as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify as a podcast. Our engineer is Gabe Jean, and thanks for listening. I will see you next week.